Colombia is a warm, populous, and modestly sized country located in South America, occupying the vital land connection between the continents of North America and South America. In the 1940s, it had a population of approximately 8 million people, and its GDP was about $45 billion. It was, indeed, a rather small but plucky and well situated country. So, why is this country's contemporary history around the time of the World War II interesting to discuss? Well, I think it's quite appropriate to begin by briefly discussing the war's dynamics and key details. The World War II was fought between two sides or groups of countries, the Axis and Allied powers. The Axis consisted of Germany, Italy, and Japan, whereas the Allies consisted of the US, Britain, USSR, and France. It officially broke out on September 1st, 1939, but Japan and the US's involvement only solidified later that year after the infamous Pearl Harbor attacks. The US, being sandwiched between the Pacific Ocean and Japan on the west, and Atlantic and European countries on the east, greatly relied on the Panama Canal to balance their involvement on both fronts. Given Colombia's proximity to the canal and their comparatively respectful naval presence, their support for the Allies during the World War II was rather vital. To better situate Colombia's circumstances during those times, a description of its politico-economic conditions during the era is quite in order. The specifics of their military state of affairs will be discussed in further detail later in the video. Colombia in the 20s and 30s was what one would call a land of opportunity for foreign businessmen. With a warm tropical weather, cheap labor, and easily corruptible government, this country was ripe to be utilized by the US's government-sanctioned goods industry that was fueled by the Americans' ever-increasing desire for tropical products such as fruit and coffee. Given the US's close influence on the country's economy and politics, it was only quite natural that Colombia had to pragmatically align themselves in the World War alongside the Allies in the late 30s. Now, speaking of Colombia's geopolitical role during the time, the Panama Canal and its surrounding waters played two important roles during wartime. One, it provided an irreplaceable connection between West Coast American ports, that is, Oakland, San Francisco, etc., and the European front of the war. On the other hand, it also could serve as the Japanese Navy's entry into the Atlantic front of the war in the rather unlikely circumstance that American naval forces were overwhelmed. For the first reason, the canal was an active subject of German sabotage attempts from surrounding countries, including Colombia, through the late 30s and early 40s. Therefore, the support of the Colombian government for the Allied effort in the World War II was rather important. The Colombian economy was primarily export-driven. The industry surrounding the production, storage, and export of tropical fruit, cocoa, and most importantly, coffee supported most of the populace. Corporate and usually foreign capital had a large influence in the country's governance, where many of the government's basic functions, such as the construction and upkeep of transport and communication infrastructure, were essentially taken care of by a small oligopoly of foreign companies for their own private benefit, limitedly supporting the country's citizens in the process. For that reason, the government's political policy was mostly directed to favor corporate interests. While the demand for the kind of goods Colombia primarily exported is usually quite inelastic during normal conditions, and the supply even more so, war, of course, can often turn things around quite the other way around. And that, sadly, is exactly what was about to happen. Global demand for non-essential food supplies, especially coffee, was sharply staggered as the war broke out in Europe. The Colombian economy was on the verge of being devastated. The American Office of Price Administration, or the AOPA, concerned about possible fluctuations in the global price of coffee, made multiple attempts to cap the export price at the level it was when the Pearl Harbor attacks occurred. This was, of course, met by uproarious objection from corporate Colombia because the cost to produce and transport coffee only increased due to the war, and capping the price on its exports would have seriously threatened the economy and American business interests. The AOPA surprisingly relented, but Colombia's troubles did not end there. Another major matter of concern was Colombia's large production capacity and reserves of platinum. Platinum was, and remains to be, a highly valuable strategic material because it can be used for many different applications, including high temperature aircraft engines and as a catalyst for producing nitric acid, which was used for making fertilizer, gunpowder, and bombs. Both the Allied and Axis powers seriously vied to control Colombia's platinum assets given the material's rarity and utility. But the American government managed to seize a large part of it by first buying out almost all of Colombia's platinum production facilities and reserves. All the same, however, a black market for the material quickly formed and grew as desperate Axis agents were willing to pay local producers great sums of money for any amount of platinum. Smuggling became a major problem in the country, but it was largely reined in by the end of the war. The black market, of course, almost instantly died off after the war ended and when countries began to demobilize. Now that we discussed the economic effects of the war at great length, we can move on to talk about the socio-political impact of the war. A major concern of the United States and a problem for South American countries, especially those with established colonies of white people like Brazil, Argentina, and of course Colombia, was the immigration and integration of ex-leaders, war criminals, and enemy agents from Axis countries as the war progressed. Just as I mentioned earlier, given Colombia's strategic location and proximity to the Panama Canal, the possibility of it being used as a springboard of sorts for sabotage and carrying out attacks on Allied assets in Central America was real and deeply concerning for the US. The Colombian government's initial disinclination to acknowledging and addressing this problem was immediately met with sanction threats from the United States, after which they eventually fell in line and efforts were made to improve their counter-sabotage techniques and immigration vetting process. SCADTA, or the Colombian German Air Transport Company, the second ever commercial airlines in the world, caused further concern in the US government since there was a fear that the pilots the company employed, who were most often European immigrants, specifically ex-German pilots, could use converted SCADTA planes to launch attacks on the Panama Canal and Allied infrastructure. Pressure from the US pushed the Colombian government to pass laws that crippled the business through multiple restrictions that severely restricted the operating freedom of the company's members and their pilots. On a side note, I think it's important to realize that all these political changes were largely made without much influence of the actual Colombian citizenry. As an autocratic country with considerable foreign corporate influence, the people of Colombia had little hand in guiding their governance. This, of course, changed when a major civil war called La Violencia broke out soon after the World War II ended, causing a considerable shift in power of sorts. Finally, talking more about Colombia's military involvement. While the government and army did officially position themselves as supporters of the Allied cause, Colombian men experienced very little actual military engagement. Apart from defending a few attacks by Germans on Colombian naval assets, the armed forces did not really see much action throughout the entirety of the war, causing the country's influence and involvement with the World War II in posterity to appear rather insignificant, although that's clearly not the case. That brings me to my conclusion. Colombia's limited military role possibly explains why its involvement in World War II is not really discussed or celebrated very much, and the case is quite the same for other countries too. India, Brazil, Argentina, Mexico, and many other countries had major roles to play in the war too, and their people made many big sacrifices simply for the sake of enduring difficult times they had little hand in creating. The picture you see right now is a map of all the countries that had an alignment or were involved in the World War II. The history of these countries during this era largely remains left out from the mainstream perception of the war because their role as supporting pillars that backed the war don't make stories as interesting as those of action, battle, or courage. While my discussion of this problem may appear to be quite the digression from the central theme of my video, I think it is quite an important point to mention because it played a large part in deciding why I chose to research this topic. All the same, with that, I conclude my video. Thank you for watching.